Tolkien used a soft magic system, unparalleled by any author, but very difficult to replicate. Join Jared Stonefield and I as we discuss how Tolkien's magic system was used. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to the White City Podcast. Today I've got with me Jared Stonefield to discuss Tolkien's magic system. How's it going, Jared?
Too bad. How about you?
Good, good. So, one thing that we're primarily going to be doing is looking at maybe some more things that have, I guess you could say, people have come up with since Tolkien wrote his books about magic systems. Um, and so, in a sense, we might be kind of working backwards in some ways on some stuff. But um, I know Jared's Jared's got a lot of this stuff, I think, down as he's written a book himself to be published soon, hopefully, at some point. Be great. Uh, but yeah, I think something that a lot of people um know or don't know, especially if you're not a avid like fantasy or Tolkien fan, you don't necessarily know the differences maybe between a hard and magic system, hard and soft magic system, that is. Um, so Tolkien used a soft magic system, and maybe to not necessarily get too deep into those differences, but like Jared, what's the difference between a hard and a soft magic system?
Yeah. A hard and soft magic system, those are kind of more modern definitions that literary scholars and critics have tried to apply both retroactively and to books that are released nowadays, specifically with fantasy and a bit into the science fiction genres. Um, Soft magic systems are normally the types of magic systems that you see in fantasy that are not often fully explained to the reader or to the viewer. They normally are much more mysterious, much more opaque. They normally will have a smaller role in the story overall or not appear as much. And you don't necessarily know where the magic comes from or what it's going to do or how it's going to be used. With a hard magic system, conversely, that is where you have a lot more rigid structure to how magic is used or anything supernatural is used in fantasy or science fiction. Much more of science fiction falls into a hard magic system. Even though it's called magic, it really can apply to anything that is beyond our current understanding or current technology. For example, how things work in Dune can actually be an example of soft or hard magic. Um, so also with hard magic systems, you have a lot more of a sense of like if character does A, then B is going to happen. You kind of have a sense of if a character is doing something, you can predict what the magical effect is going to be, and then those rules are often expanded upon, or for a little bit of drama added in, can be broken, and that's always a fun thing to explore. So yeah, that's the basic difference between hard and soft magic. Those definitions never really existed in the past. It was more just up to the discretion of the author. And I mean, it still is. It's not something that I think authors are feel any need to be boxed in by, but they are very helpful platforms for building off of as a writer and as a reader or as a viewer, looking at a particular type of story and the role of magic within it.
Right. So yeah, Lord of the Rings definitely doesn't really have that kind of say cause and effect of magic in the world. Um, and Lord of the Rings being just like a general term for Middle Earth, really. But yeah. So I know we were kind of talking about this before, but so like, yeah, like maybe you had said this already, but again, like there isn't much. How would you say? Much like magic that's being used really in your face, um, outside of in Lord of the Rings. I mean, outside of maybe like the one thing I can think of is when I'm pretty sure this is also in the book when the Witch King's sword flames up right before he's going to attack Gandalf at Minas Tirith is like the only moment, especially in Lord of the Rings books, that I can necessarily think of where it's like I am putting my sword on fire without him actually like saying anything, you know. Um, but yeah, like what are other instances maybe that's magic is used that is like a good indicator of it being a soft magic system in Lord of the Rings, would you say?
Of course. So, pretty much that anything Gandalf does, um, is he uses magic very sparingly throughout both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. I would actually argue he uses magic more in The Hobbit than probably he does in the entirety of The Lord of the Rings. Um, and it's not in any way like Harry Potter, for example. Harry Potter is a great example of a hard magic system. You have a wand, and the wand has a super powered core. And if you say certain incantations, certain things are going to happen, and there's no necessarily like a depletion of energy. There's no battery or charging up system that you have for your wand. But you overall pretty much know the mechanics of how a wizard fight could happen. In Lord of the Rings, you definitely don't have that. Um, and in The Hobbit as well. I mean, we see Gandalf in The Hobbit, for example, set fire to pine cones, and he like so that they can be thrown down at the wargs and kind of scare them. You see Gandalf talking to birds and beasts, and it's also mentioned that his fellow wizard Radagast can do that. Um, but it's not something that we see that much. It's not something that we have any sort of like concrete idea of how that happened, how he learned that. Um, and it's very nebulous and it only appears really in the story when it needs to. Um, and other than that, it's kind of I wouldn't say forgotten, but it's used very sparingly and to great effect.
Yeah. Yeah, um so like for the way that it affects the story, it has very little effect on like how the story plays out, wouldn't you say?
It depends. So with Lord of the Rings, it's also kind of hard because even Tolkien had trouble with the term magic itself. Um, I mean, you could argue that magic is the absolute foundation of Lord of the Rings because of the One Ring itself. The One Ring is a form of magic. The Lord of the Rings, in its very first draft, was actually going to be called the Magic Ring. Um, and the thing is, with the magic of the One Ring, it really does set up a lot of the internal struggle for Frodo, a struggle for a lot of the characters, based on how it seems to kind of stoke temptation in people's souls and people's hearts. Um, I think overall, magic looked at a certain way can have a huge effect on the story. But at the same time, Gandalf isn't necessarily, going off and challenging every character with, like a wizard staff duel. And it's not like, Harry Potter, they're just like throwing spells at each other kind of deal. Um, so it can be central to the story overall and like add, a bit of like emotional depth to it and kind of, like I said, stoke the flame of the plot. But overt uses of magic, it's kind of rare in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. Yeah. So what you're saying, like there are cases where like you've got Elrond reading the map to Erebor in the moonlight is like a very key moment in the Hobbit book. And I mean, there's magic there, right?
Yeah.
Like that kind of a thing.
Yeah, and again, it's so here's also the thing with magic too, as it's used in Tolkien. Um, Magic basically kind of encompasses any sort of supernatural art or craft or means that something happens or something does something fantastical. So, for example, um, a great example would be Frodo's sword turning blue. Um, yes, that can be an important part of the plot here or there. Um, but it's not something that we have, a lot of answers about. We may have more questions than answers about why does the sword turn blue? Like, how were the elven smiths who made it originally able to do that? Um, and it's also, it's pretty sparingly used as well. I mean, and whenever it does happen, especially in the movies, I think the movies actually do a very good job of using that to create a sense of suspense. Anytime they see a blue sword, oh no, something really bad is about to happen. Get ready. Um, which is a great example of how soft magic can be used, even though it's mysterious and used sparingly to heighten emotion, to serve the story. But it's not going to be necessarily the focal point. And if you think about the um, for example, like Merry and Pippin's story. Merry and Pippin's story doesn't necessarily revolve around magic that much. I mean, it has some magical catalysts. For example, like the Ents waking up and marching off. But is that even really magic, or is that just how the Ents are? You could also argue, Pippin sees into the Palantir something, and he and Gandalf have to go to Minas Tirith. Um, but again, that doesn't really play that much of a part in Pippin's storyline. It's just it's a moment that happens, and it is a catalyst for a lot of other things that go on in the story. But it's not something that is repeatedly occurring. It's just more of like an extra like dramatic flair, or as like I said, like a catalyst for the rest of the story to take place, and a lot of the other character growth and emotional growth to happen.
Yeah. So, like you were, it's kind of touching on how like Tolkien was trying to figure out the magic system, and the whole thing. Like, did he like how much did he actually like go into like going through it, and did he consider how much it would have like an impact on the story?
Yeah, so there's actually a letter that he wrote. Uh, Letters by Tolkien are referred to by numbers. In letter 155, something that he says is, "I'm afraid I have been far too casual about magic and the use of that word. Though Galadriel and others show criticism of the mortal use of the word, the thought about it is not altogether casual, but it is a very large question and difficult in a story which is largely about motives." I think that was something that and you can see this as you read through Tolkien's letters. Um, it's not really about magic; it's more about motive. It's not really about how things happen or how things are brought about. It's more about what they're used for. I think the forging of the rings is an excellent example of this. Um, in the original lore, especially as revealed in the Unfinished Tales, the Silmarillion, he never goes into major depth about what's put into the rings, or how Sauron and the elves, what they used of their crafts, in quotation marks, to put into the rings, to make them stave off decay or do these fantastical things. But the motive behind the ring's creations was everything. The elves wanted immortality. They wanted to have perfection on Earth. Sauron wanted mastery and dominion. And the rings caused a lot of, emotional turmoil. Um, so the magic is, or the fantastical element of it, is very incidental to the heart of the story, to the emotion behind it, which is a fascinating way of utilizing magic or fantastical elements in a story. He really showed a lot of mastery in that. Um, and again, that's not to say that, like, for example, a hard magic system, like in Harry Potter, can't be used to the same effect or anything like that. But Tolkien took a very hard concept, or a very tough concept, I should say, and really developed it well before anyone else really popularized that. Like Tolkien is often, I think, rightly called the father of modern fantasy. Um, and so he was thinking about a lot of these questions in depth, and he was treating fantasy as an art form, thinking about it very seriously as a form of literature in an age where it was very much so looked down upon. And so, like, just reading his thoughts about how he was viewing magic um, in both like a mythological and an emotional sense is fascinating.
Like what you brought up there about motives, that that's really really interesting. Because to me that would play more into what I think like Tolkien would want to emphasize in a lot of his stories with themes um and like character, I guess to a certain extent, character arcs as well, over magic, I guess.
Mhm.
What do you think of that?
Yeah, for sure. Um, I think that the fantasy was always meant to kind of draw our attention back to the heart of the story. It was supposed to, and definitely did create a sense of wonder, create a sense of intrigue. Um, but I think it was always meant to point back to the emotional realities. Um, Again, the One Ring, perfect example of this. We don't have to spend a whole bunch of time wondering what went into the creation of the One Ring, or how the mechanics of it worked and how Sauron bound himself and his essence to it. um, it's incidental to the fact that it is a corrupting influence. It is a darkness. It is an obsession with the material world, and mastery and dominion over others in a very dark sense. Um, and I think that's kind of just like the core of everything that the Lord of the Rings is about. I think the elves in general are a really good representation of that, because they are by far the most like fantastical of the creatures in Tolkien's world, arguably. Um, and they can do a lot of strange, supernatural, amazing things that are not very easily understood. But the elves almost always have a good motive behind what they're doing. Um, and that is a really important distinction that, again, Tolkien talks about in another one of his letters. He talks about how a lot of the elven magic, that we would call it, was artistic, and it was never um, intended to deceive. However, it would never deceive elves. However, to men, it just looked like something bizarre. It looked like something supernatural, and it might, confuse or frighten a man looking at this for the first time. And that was never really like the elves' intent. Um, for elves, the difference between, um, you know, using magic for like good or bad or deceiving or not deceiving is kind of, Tolkien described it as like the difference to us between art and life. Like we're not going to confuse a statue with a real person. And that's kind of like how the elves saw things. Um, if they ever used like magic or fantastical means as like an art form, it was never meant to deceive or confuse. And to other elves, that would be very obvious. But to men who have a much more limited worldview in Tolkien's works, they have a lot less of a clue of what's going on in the big grand scheme around them, they can get easily scared and confused by elven magic. And that can also, it also eventually does lead to like kind of the estrangement between men and elves. Um, so yeah, and like again, it all goes back to the idea of magic kind of as being a catalyst, um, or a cause for emotional strife or character development, even between species. So elves and men are kind of afraid of elves. They're kind of afraid of what they can do. They're a bit envious of what they can do. That's something we see repeatedly throughout Tolkien's works. Um, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, because it also, like you're saying, so like the elves, very much in a sense magical in their own right. Men, not really. It's like the hobbits, like don't have really anything at all,
Yeah.
um, unless they have like the one ring and they go invisible.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because I don't know. You might seem like the ring is almost more of a like harder side of the magic than maybe a lot of the other things.
Yes, definitely. Um, it's definitely you have much more of a sense of like what's going to happen, what's going to work with it. For example, like if you put that ring on, A, Sauron's going to be able to see you, but B, no one else is. So there is a cost, but there's also a benefit to it, and it's something that is used fairly often throughout the story, mostly to the main character's advantage. So that actually, I've heard it argued before, excuse me, that the ring is probably the best example or one of the only examples of hard magic that's used in Tolkien's system. And again, it's very hard. That's also kind of the problem of trying to boil down such a huge work into just the term of soft or hard magic. They're not perfect definitions by any stretch of the means. Um, because it doesn't cover everything that happens in a story and all of the uses of magic throughout a story. But yeah, no, it's a very interesting concept. And there is one more thing I just wanted to add, and you kind of reminded me about it when we were talking about how elves definitely have a good sense of like magic in their own right, but men, can they use magic? That's actually a question that Tolkien never really answered. He struggled with it. He literally in his own letters, he I could not make a decision on whether or not men could use magic. Um, and that's kind of like it comes back to the question of like, well, what is magic in Tolkien's world? Is it things that are supernatural? Okay. Well, what defines natural or what defines supernatural? Is supernatural something beyond the skill or knowledge of men? Um, Maybe. So yeah, it's a really fascinating concept. He talks about, I think he literally wrote the question in one of his letters, in one of the rough drafts of his letters. He wrote, "The Numenorians used spells in making swords?" Question mark. Like he couldn't decide if like the Numenorians, who are descendants of elves roughly, um he was like, well, since they were descendants of elves, can they use magic? Can they do things like that? Um, and he never answered that. And it's interesting too because you have the whole thing with Isildur and the Oath Pact. The King of the Dead and the Oathbreakers, they're men, and so is Isildur. But Isildur is from Numenor. So are the Numenorians the only men that can use magic? And is it because they broke an oath with a Numenorian that they're now stuck as ghosts? Or is it just because they broke an important oath in general? It's never answered, and I don't think Tolkien ever figured that out for himself. Which is also kind of one of the hard things about a soft magic system is that you may never get an answer as a reader, and you may never get an answer as a writer, because you're like, well, I don't even know how this works.
That's great. But you just brought up something to me too. Is okay. Here's a question: is the fact that Aragorn has the sword the way that he is able to to basically like how would you say control the army of the dead, or is it because that he's the heir? It's like does he act? Because in the move, I mean in the book, he already has the sword, and it's not like oh here have this so that you can now go in. It's like well he is the heir, right?
Mhm.
So should he be able just to go in and command them without the sword?
Yeah. So that's something that the movies kind of confuse. Um, and I don't get me wrong, love the movies. Who doesn't? Um, but they do kind of simplify, and I understand movies have to simplify things for a general audience. You only have so much time. You're projecting your movie to a wide audience. I get it. But with the movies, it kind of implies that the fact that the sword is remade is like a big factor in this. Um, I would argue it from the books, no. That actually has very little, if anything, to do with it. I think the sword is almost entirely symbolic. Um, the thing with in Tolkien, in Middle Earth, especially in the Silmarillion, oaths are a huge thing in Tolkien's works, and breaking an oath is so bad. um, and oaths really often cause more trouble than they're worth. It's built off of a very old mythological concept um, that you see repeatedly throughout legends, especially in Europe, that the breaking of an oath is a very, very dark, dangerous thing. And oaths are very much so binding, especially when you swear them by certain things. And so the fact that Isildur made that oath with them and then cursed them after breaking it, I think the books pretty much strongly imply, if not overtly say, um, it's the fact that Aragorn is Isildur's heir that makes him able to call and lead the army, and that he has the power to set them free. Um, but yeah, again, it's whether or not that's because the only time we really know of oaths being used or broken in such a fantastical way often goes back to the elves. And so Aragorn is a very, very, very distant descendant of the elves. So is that also why he has, the ability to keep this oath and release them from their oath once they fulfilled their purpose? Maybe. I don't know. Neither did Tolkien.
Yeah, right. No, it's interesting you like just pulled out oaths as being a big thing and let your yes be yes and your no be no. I don't know what I can't remember passage of scripture that's from, but um, sure. Yeah, so I definitely what?
One of the Gospels.
Yeah, so I definitely think that that Tolkien, yeah, like there's numerous places like you're saying,
Yeah.
especially the Silmarillion, it comes out like that. So, um, but yeah, was there anything else you were thinking on, or did you said everything you wanted to say?
I think pretty much we covered a lot of it. Yeah. I just think
Okay.
that one more thing that I just I think kind of drives home the concept. I think it's one of the most telling quotes in the Lord of the Rings books is a quote by Galadriel. When she's introducing Frodo and Sam to the Mirror of Galadriel, she says, "For this is what your folk would call magic, I believe, though I do not understand clearly what they mean. And they seem also to use the same word of the deceits of the enemy." Again, I think that kind of encapsulates or summarizes a lot of what we were talking about with the use of the supernatural in Tolkien's works. Um, it's definitely um, always seen as something very much so mysterious, kind of beyond our understanding. Because we also have to remember, officially, The Lord of the Rings is written by hobbits. Like the actual books themselves are supposed to be as written by hobbits. So that's also kind of a reason why it's a soft magic system. The hobbits didn't fully understand what was going on. And they never learned all the answers, so we never learn all the answers. And I think that's a very unique narrative way of tying that all in together.
Yeah, yeah, I was just thinking that too with, yeah, our perspective is the hobbits, for a big way, right? And and the magic system isn't fully understood, and the hobbits don't fully understand it. So that's kind of where the I guess where that goes with the story. Yeah.
Yeah, they're our audience surrogates because they're going out and learning all this new stuff about the world, and we get to learn it with them, which is age old narrative technique, and it uh, Tolkien uses it brilliantly.
Well, yeah. Thanks, Jared, for coming on, and it's great to talk more Tolkien and go over magic. So
Always happy to
yeah,
do it.
this is fun. And thanks everybody for tuning in. We'll catch you for our next episode next week.